Okay, so that was informative. I have taken my time, just like our last study in chapter 1. I've gone over some of this cultural context, historical context, commentary, verse by verse, digging a little deeper, seeing if there's anything that can help us answer some of those questions, engage some of those observations that we had. And I've found some interesting stuff. As usual, I've recorded some clips of my sheets of paper so you can see what I've written down. I'm going to go over the main interpretation points and cultural historical context stuff that I've found. So in verse 1, we're introduced to a group of people called the Magi. That term refers to people who were pagan astrologers whose divining skills were greatly respected in the Greek Roman world. So during that time period, there were people who were known for being astrologers, these magi, and they were respected. Astrology, for those of you who don't know, is the study of movements or positions of celestial bodies, meaning stars, planets, different kinds of things in outer space, studying them from the belief that they can be used to predict or are related to human affairs or the future. So basically, predicting the future, or somehow astrologers would believe that being able to read the signs, read the stars, would help them discern people's destinies and that kind of stuff. So the Magi are a group of people from the East that are astrologers, and they believe this kind of stuff. Now, thinking from a Jewish person's perspective, astrology, divining through signs, trying to tell the future, that kind of stuff through nature and all that, was actually forbidden in the Jewish Old Testament scriptures. It's directly forbidden. So if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 13, as well as Isaiah chapter 2, verse 6, and Isaiah chapter 47, verses 11 through 15, those are a few Old Testament scripture examples that the Jews would have been familiar with, where God is specifically either forbidding, like astrology, divining, practices that the nations around them would have been doing, or speaking negatively of it. And it's actually in that same spot, Deuteronomy chapter 18, where it says that God was telling the Jews, his people, to listen to a prophet who he would raise up, a prophet who would speak his words, who would speak his commands to his people. And that's in chapter 18, verses 14 through 20. So in a sense, we see this interesting contrast where Israel's ruler, who is a Jew, Herod, he acts like a pagan king in the sense of how he responds to the idea of the Messiah actually coming. He's disturbed, he's frightened. We learn that he actually wants to kill the one who is supposed to be the Messiah, Jesus. While these non-Jews, these magi, who are actually operating in something that God in the Old Testament forbade his people to do, they have come with the intention to honor Israel's true king. So even though these magi were pagan, they weren't Jews, God was choosing to reveal himself to them. So that's interesting. Another thing about the astrology side of things, my historical commentary said that ancient peoples at this time believed comets and falling stars could predict the fall of rulers. So if you saw a comet, the current king, that could be a prediction through the stars, through the celestial bodies, that king was about to lose their ability to rule, or they were going to fall. So though, once again, the Jews in the Old Testament are forbade from abiding by that kind of stuff, culturally during this time, it makes us understand more of what Herod, who is already not really relating as a Jew, how that he could get ingrained with that type of culture and mentality and feel, in a way, a sense of valid fear that his rulership was being threatened or was about to be taken away. The prophecy referenced in verse 6 comes from the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, and just some additional stuff. The town of Bethlehem had been King David's hometown. So King David from the Old Testament, that had been his hometown. Bethlehem was 6 miles south of Jerusalem. So not really that far from Jerusalem where Herod was living. In verse 9, the way it reads, it says that the Magi, the star they had seen when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. So it reads as if there's a supernatural sign going on where the star is literally moving and then it literally stops. And from some of the reading I've done, it's thought that either the verses here are just implying that there was some type of movement, meaning that the Magi were seeing it move because they were physically moving towards it and they got to where it was like over and then they stopped. There's another thought that this is actually a supernatural sign, and it is something that for the Jews who would be reading it, they might be thinking back to, and once again in the Old Testament, where God led the Israelites by fire and by a cloud during the Old Testament Exodus. So in the book of Exodus, chapter 13, verses 21 through 22, it describes how God led the ancient Israelites in that way. And that could be something they could be thinking of with this type of supernatural sign or writing. The way that the Magi respond to Jesus, verse 11, they bow down, they worship him, they present treasures, gifts of gold, frankincense, myrrh. The way they relate to Jesus historically was a way of relating that would have been similar to how people during that day and time from where they were from in the East would have related to gods or kings. So they are really showing Jesus an honor that is not just, oh, you're someone of importance, but it's someone of supreme importance. The prophecy referenced in verse 15 comes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Thinking about Herod's order to kill all the young boys under 2 years old. Historically, Herod was known for acts of violence and undeserved executions. This included people in his immediate family. For example, he killed one of his wives and had multiple of his sons killed. Also, just talking about the order that he gave in this passage, the Jews saw killing of babies as an evil and pagan act. Sometimes the Romans would kill babies that were born deformed. Also, there's historical records of times that killing of babies would be used to control the population. So in this way, though Herod is supposed to be a Jew, he is acting completely un-Jewish. Some might have seen Jesus' escape from Herod's child-killing order as a strong parallel to the Old Testament story of Moses as a baby, when Moses escaped the Egyptian Pharaoh's order to kill all the Jewish male babies. So a correlation from Jesus to that Old Testament key figure of Moses. The prophecy referenced in verse 18 comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, verse 15. Nazareth was a small town about 55 miles north of Jerusalem. And then finally, in verse 23, Matthew writes, "So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." In the research that I was doing, it is not completely clear what specific verse in the Old Testament Matthew is referencing, but there are some debated options, depending on if Matthew meant it to be a blend of different texts or verses, or if he was trying to go for more of a play on words. So some interesting stuff in the interpretation side for this chapter. Let's continue to process that as we move into the final video for this chapter concerning application.